If you weren't there last week, our outdoor service and picnic was just great. We had a wonderful time, and big thanks to all the people that made that a reality. Especially the guys that were barbecuing. They didn't even get over to the picnic. They were here running the smokers, I think, for about 24 hours, but we all benefited greatly from their labors, so thank you. Well, today we're going to wrap up the series we've been doing this summer called David's Greatest Hits, Solid Gold Psalms. And next week we're going to start a new series, and we're going to be working through Romans chapter 12. And I've called this series Holy Tweets at Romans 12. Now, if you're not a Twitter user, you may not understand that, but if you use Twitter, when you send out a Twitter message, it's called a tweet. And Paul could have tweeted all of Romans 12 because it's just a bunch of short instructions about what it means to lead a holy life, to follow God with all of our heart. And so we're going to work our way through that. And as part of that, I would like to encourage us as a church body to memorize Romans chapter 12. Now, some of you are going to say, I can't memorize stuff. And I would be chief among those. I want you to know I worked this week, and I've already got the first 3 verses nailed. So if I can do it, you can do it. Trust me, okay? So you have this week to get a little jump on things. Start looking at those first 3 verses. As we go along, I'll try and give you some ideas about ways you can help yourself remember stuff. I will probably expose to you just how terrible of an artist I am, so you can look forward to that. And but I think it'd be a fun project for all of us together to memorize Romans 12. This morning, we want to take a look at Psalm 27. And let me just read to you the first 3 verses of Psalm 27. The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is the stronghold of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid? When evildoers assail me to eat up my flesh, my adversaries and foes, it is they who stumble and fall. Though an army encamp against me, my heart shall not fear. Though war arise against me, yet I will be confident. David appears to be writing this psalm to strengthen himself for opposition that he's going to face. And the way that he does it is he thinks back to the ways that God has provided in the past, and he reminds himself that the same God that has protected him in the past is the same God who's going to be with him in the future. And he counsels himself not to be afraid. I told you that this Sunday I was going to give a more detailed report on what my trip was like to Ukraine. And that in itself is kind of a big task, because how do you take the experiences of those 2 weeks that included going 10 time zones, over 36 hours in planes and airports, 17 hours on trains, 50 plus hours in automobiles. So yes, I did do planes, trains, and automobiles. And I even got a couple hours on a boat worked in there. Crazy but true story. When I get to Frankfurt, Germany on the way home, I get on the plane, and there on the same plane is my daughter's high school best friend from Squim, Blair Maloney, and we met in Frankfurt on the plane. But how do you pack all of that into a brief and hopefully somewhat interesting report and talk about Psalm 27 at the same time? I didn't plan this when I started, but this week as I was looking at Psalm 27, it just struck me that there are a lot of connection points between the two. So hopefully, if all goes well, we'll kind of do both these things together, and we'll talk about Psalm 27, and we'll talk about Ukraine. David in Psalm 27 is facing conflict. He's facing opposition. And David throughout his life ran into different kinds of opposition. There was interpersonal conflict he had for sure. If you know your Bible, you know that Saul, the king before David, was very jealous of David and actually wanted him put to death. And throughout his life, David ran into great interpersonal conflicts. But David also knew what it was to face military conflict. I think when we read the Psalms and we read language about war and about battle, we tend to read it through kind of a metaphorical lens. that it's kind of symbolic language for personal conflict and challenges and opposition. But when David wrote about war, he meant war. He meant like real soldiers with real arrows and spears and swords and people dying and winners and losers. When David talked about war, he understood war. Most of us have never experienced war in our homeland. Some of you have served in the military. Thank you for that. And you know what war looks like when you get to a battlefield. But we haven't felt war come right here to us. But imagine the tightening in your gut. If you were to get up in the morning and look out at the horizon and you saw a dark line forming out there, and you realize that that line were thousands of well-armed enemy soldiers descending on you with the intent to kill and to pillage and to enslave. David knew what that felt like. He knew what that looked like. As he thinks ahead to the opposition that he's going to face in his life, some of it interpersonal, some of it a very physical kinds of military threat, Psalm 27, he preaches himself a little sermon, reminding himself not to be overwhelmed by his very natural and understandable fears. Tim Keller said something several years ago that I've kind of hung on to, and you'll hear me reference this again, I'm sure. He says that we need to preach to ourselves more than we listen to ourselves. We all know what it's like to listen to ourselves, and we get overwhelmed with our fears, our anxieties, our angst. And yet David stops and he preaches himself a sermon. And he says, "Don't forget, O my soul, who is with you? Who is the one who's going before you? Who is the one who's delivered you in the past and who will deliver you again?" You know, we may not have faced people attacking our homeland, but thousands, tens of thousands of Ukrainians know that experience well. My journey to Ukraine began by going all the way to East Ukraine. And so where is Ukraine from here? Well, that's Dungeness Community Church, dead center. And so if we take off from there, and if we spin the globe around about 10 time zones, we're going to center right there on Ukraine. If you want a sense of scale, Ukraine is about the same size as Texas. And so I started with a plane ride that took me to Frankfurt, and then from Frankfurt on to Kiev, kind of right in the center of Ukraine. And then from there, didn't even leave the airport, stayed in the airport for 3 hours and got on another plane and flew about another 2 hours to Zaporozhye. And then getting to Zaporozhye, it was getting pretty late at night, but we weren't done yet. Got on a car, and we went another 6 hours down to a place called Dungeness. And there we checked into a lovely Soviet-era hotel. You haven't experienced hospitality till you stayed in a Soviet-era hotel. It's dark. It's cavernous. When you check in, the lady is not happy to see you. She led us through these dark halls. No lights are on. I mean, it's kind of this warren weaving around to finally come to a room, which I'm not sure why we went to so much trouble to get there, because I think we're the only people in the place. You have a shared bathroom that's down the hall that has no toilet seats. When you get to your bed, the frame looked pretty good. It had wood slats, and then it had a not more than 2-inch solid pad on top of the wood slats. So very comfortable. Also in Ukraine, they don't make the bed for you in hotels. They just stack the sheets on top. If you want the bed made, you can make it yourself. You can also buy the toilet paper to go with your room. So everything about it makes you feel welcome. Then, the next morning, we met with some folks in a church. I'll tell you about that in a minute. And then we got in the car again, and we went farther east to a place called Marica. And one of the things you find out, there we are heading out to Marica. One of the things you find out is Ukrainians love sunflowers, sunflower seeds. They apparently eat a lot of them. Now, the crazy thing is, I didn't actually see any Ukrainians eating sunflower seeds, but they kept telling me how much they love sunflower seeds. When I say they love them, I'm talking tens of thousands of acres of sunflowers that you drive by. And East Ukraine appears to be the big growing region for sunflowers, which was really pretty. Our driver throughout all of this was a guy named Sasha. He's the guy right there in the foreground. And when we get out of the car, Sasha kept saying something to Sergei. Sergei is the guy standing immediately to my left there in the middle. And Sasha would say something to Sergei. And this happened 2 or 3 times. But we couldn't tell what they were saying, right? It's in Ukrainian. And finally, Mike, who's picking up on it, he was a little bit of Ukrainian. He says, okay, what are you guys talking about? Oh, they didn't really want to tell us. And we pushed them, come on, what are you talking about? And both of them look at us. Together in unison, they say, don't slam the door. Apparently, Americans close car doors a lot harder than Ukrainians do. So that became the running joke for the whole trip, was don't slam the door. And so Mike and I worked hard to perfect our door closing technique. We made some progress, but it was a good trip. But as you get farther into East Ukraine, you begin to realize that all is not well. Sure, there's a lot of sunflowers along the road, but you also have signs like this. And what that says is, don't step off the road, there are landmines here. And that was everywhere. And you find that you are, in fact, walking into a war zone. 4 years ago, you probably know that Russia invaded into East Ukraine and took that big swath of land. What it did for Russia was it gave them a land bridge to the Black Sea. That was really the goal of it, probably. It also creates enough turmoil in Ukraine that NATO does not want to let Ukraine join NATO because of that conflict. And that's just fine with Putin because he likes having that buffer between him and NATO. And unfortunately for Ukrainians, there still are some hard feelings toward the West because we had all promised we'd be there for them. But when Russia actually invaded, all of us, Europe, us, everybody kind of looked the other way and didn't do anything. When you get into Mariupol, where we were at, you see the evidence of what happened. These poor people had no idea this was coming. They found themselves suddenly caught in the middle of a crossfire. Just a tremendous fight that went on. These buildings have been shelled and destroyed. Here is a home. And you saw this all over. Houses collapsed and leveled. The walls along the roads, everything was riddled with bullet holes. This was the mini mart that we stopped at. The back side of it has been thoroughly shot up. And in fact, as we're standing here, they're pointing at that hill up there, and they said, right up there, that's where the Russians are. And they said, you see these trees? See the ones that don't have any limbs on them? They said, those were all stripped bare because of the gunfire going through the trees. That was that level of fighting going on in this area. It actually isn't safe there yet. They said it would be safe, but that appears to have been a Ukrainian version of safe. As we're going through the town on a narrow little back alley, we get to a point where our driver looks ahead. He'd grown up there, and he goes, we should not go any farther down this road. Okay, let's not go any farther down this road. That sounds like just a wonderful idea. We crossed another road, and they said, the snipers have often fired down this street as we're crossing it. You have this picture like the carnival, the little ducks going by in the shooting gallery. That was what I'm thinking, right? We get across. Sergei, the other Ukrainian, he says, oh, wait, back the car up. I want to get a picture. We backed the car up in the middle of the street so he can get a picture. You know, again, the duck goes back across the road to see if they missed us the first time. There isn't a lot of fighting now. It's kind of at a standstill. However, there still are skirmishes. I understand that about a week ago, there were 2 more Ukrainian soldiers that were killed in skirmishes near this area, and so it still is a very hot, live situation. In the result of the battle in East Ukraine, about 70% of the population just fled, and that's what you saw. The houses are just empty. People just ran away to escape all of the gunfire. But in the midst of all of that, we met some people that had peace. Psalm 27, verses 4 through 8. One thing I've asked of the Lord, and that I will seek after, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, to gaze upon the beauty of the Lord and to inquire in his temple. For he will hide me in his shelter in the day of trouble. He will conceal me under the cover of his tent. He will lift me high upon a rock. And now my head shall be lifted up above my enemies all around me. And I will offer in his tent sacrifices with shouts of joy. I will sing and make melody to the Lord. Hear, O Lord, when I cry aloud. Be gracious to me and answer me. You have said, seek my face. My heart says to you, your face, Lord, do I seek. We met people in the midst of that war zone that were seeking his face. And their heads were lifted up. They were not lost in hopelessness. Many of the people, when you walk the street, you can tell that these are dejected and bitter people, that they have lost everything. And yet, these people had hope. Pastor Vasya, who hosted us there, he chose to move there, I believe it was 2 or 3 years ago, with his family, his wife, who's expecting, and the 3 kids they have. Is that little guy cute or what? But they chose to move into this area so that he could minister to these people, that he could share the gospel with them and try to bring healing. And we got to visit the 2 congregations that he pastors. Both congregations meet every day. But you can understand, people in a place like this, they need to be together on a regular basis. And so he pastors those congregations 6 days a week. I think there's one day they don't meet. One of them, the larger of the 2 congregations, meets in an abandoned school building. It's in pretty sad shape, but the second floor is okay, and that's where they have their meetings. And then the other one is a much smaller congregation. They meet in the stairwell of a building, just at the bottom of the stairwell. That's all they've got, about 10 to 12 people that meet there. But I think my favorite picture from Ukraine came from that little congregation in the stairwell. My traveling companion was a guy named Mike Bowerman. Now, Mike is 6'4", and was a college football player back in the day. He is now the executive director for the Eunice Brown Foundation, and they were the ones who invited me to go along. So here's Mike, and here is the little babushka that he met. Isn't that a great picture? I wish I could have heard this woman tell her stories, because she has seen a lot. The larger church, well, for this small congregation, you could tell they got into discussion, and although we didn't speak the language, we could pick up enough to know that it had veered into politics. And you could see that the anger began to well up pretty quickly in these people. They were pretty animated talking about their situation. Afterwards, we were talking with Sergey, and he said, in this little congregation, it's only about a year old. And he said, you see a lot of that. You see the anger and the bitterness well up very quickly. He said, the larger congregation we were in, back in Dungeness, he said 2 to 3 years ago, they were much the same. He said, if you could have watched them for the last 2 to 3 years, you would have seen this change come over that group of people. There is peace. There is hope in a place where they had no hope before. I thought of Psalm 27, verse 13. David says, I believe that I shall look upon the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living. David says, even in my trials, I have hope. I don't believe this trial is the end. I will still see God's goodness. And that's what you see happening in Dungeness because of people like Pastor Vasya. You see hope being put back into a situation that by all human standards is hopeless. One of the things that was neat about the trip, we found out that Pastor Vasya doesn't have a car. So he's got a family, children, an expecting wife, and he has no car. Right now, they do everything using public transit, which isn't real reliable when you're in a war zone. The Eunice Brown home, which we support, is going to be sending money to help Pastor Vasya get a car. And so you're part of that. And it was great to see that we could bless him in that way. One of the other people we met there in the east was the young gal right in the middle. That is Anita. Anita was, I guess you always are. She's an orphan. Parents abandoned her very young age, and she was raised in one of the orphanages that we'd be visiting in West Ukraine later. Anita was kind of a wild thing growing up. Mike Bowerman, who I was traveling with, he's been going to Ukraine for like 23 years, so he actually knew Anita when she was really little. And he said, oh my goodness, she was the wild child. And of course, she came out of a gypsy culture, And so that culture, oftentimes stealing and making mayhem, is something that's very accepted. Mike says the way he first met Anita was they did a group photo at the orphanage. And when the photo was all done, Anita comes up to him and she hands him a handful of money. And she says, "Here's your money." And he says, "Why do you have my money?" She says, "Well, because the kid next to you stole it, but I got it back." Mike says the great thing is when they got the group picture back, you look at the picture, you can see the kid's hand going into Mike's pocket. They actually took it right as he was taking it. But that was Anita, and yet as she grew up, she came to have a real love and relationship with Jesus Christ. And she now has gone to East Ukraine to work with youth. And everywhere we went around town, if you saw young people, they'd recognize Anita and they wanted to talk to her. Well, after a few days in the east, we headed back to Kiev, and that meant that we had to get back in the car at 3 a.m., 6 hours back to the airport, and then take the plane back to Kiev. And once we got there, we got to do a little bit of sightseeing. And to get downtown, we took what I understand is the deepest subway in the world. This is below Kiev. To tell you just how deep it is, we got on the escalator to come up. At the end, we rode the escalator for 4 minutes. That's how far down we were. Kiev has got beautiful architecture, just all around the city. So much history there. This is St. Sophia's Cathedral, gorgeous building. And then St. Andrew's Church. And the emerald green on that is just really spectacular to see. The city is very modern. Really enjoyed being in Kiev, but it's also a city that's had great conflict. 4 years ago, there were the Euromaidan demonstrations. This lasted for about 5 days. It happened out in what they call Independence Square. Tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people filled the streets and refused to leave. And what they were upset about was the corruption of their president and his cronies. They were just thugs, and they were robbing the country blind, and the people had had it. They filled the streets, and they demanded that he leave. And they refused to go home until he left. It started out as peaceful demonstrations. This was back in February of 2014. But unfortunately, it took a violent turn when the government decided to have snipers open fire on the crowd. At least 100 people were killed. I say at least because they say that the government was sending agents in to steal bodies out of the hospital and dispose of them so no one knows what the actual death count was. Thousands, of course, were wounded in the shooting, and a lot of violence ensued, but ultimately they did get the president to leave. He was given refuge in Russia. That then became the precipitating event for Russia to invade East Ukraine, supposedly to help reestablish order, right? But what they really wanted was that chunk of land. As we're walking in the streets, you would see where they were still putting cobblestones back in the streets. And the people we were with explained, they said, when that demonstration happened, the people tore up all of the cobblestones and threw them at the police. And they said old women that couldn't throw stones used pry bars to pry stones up and give them to young men who could. So just that kind of outpouring. One of the sad things that you saw was in the wake of the Euromaidan revolution, there was a lot of optimism. People were like, we got rid of the crooks, we're going to rebuild the country, very pro-Ukrainian, lots of Ukrainian flags flying. What they told me, though, was that about 2 years after that, they figured out that the new administration was just as corrupt as the old administration. And at that point, people just threw their hands up and said, who cares? And the goal at that point became to just get out because they saw it as a hopeless situation to try and fix. But again, you meet people in the midst of that have a lot of hope. We got to go to church Sunday morning in Kiev, and great little group of folks. They had a whole bunch of young marrieds. They're not all in this picture, but just a neat group. This is their worship team on Sunday morning. Some of the music you'd recognize. You wouldn't know the words, but you'd recognize the tunes. And I met some other really fascinating people there. One of them was a Christian psychologist who works with people suffering from post-traumatic stress. And you can imagine, in a country like Ukraine, she has no shortage of clientele because so many people have lost homes, family, been caught up in war. And so that is how she ministers, is helping people deal with the effects of that post-traumatic stress. There were some hard stories. I met a woman named Mia. Older lady, she wanted to talk. She had a friend who could translate. Her two friends came with her. And so she began to tell me her story. She had grown up in Georgia, not like down toward Alabama. We're talking Georgia in Russia, right? So she's grown up in Russia. She got involved with a church there that taught her that you shouldn't seek any medical attention, that it should just be faith, and that faith would cure everything. And her son had diabetes. And because of that church's teaching, they're urging she did not seek any medical treatment for him. And her son, at about age 11, died because of his diabetes. She, of course, was devastated. The authorities also got involved, and as soon as that church realized that there might be legal trouble brewing, they put her out of the church. So this poor woman lost everything. She lost her son. She lost her friends. She ended up leaving her home, moving to Kiev, where she knew no one. She told me that the two ladies there with her, she said, these are the only friends that I have. All because there was a church that simply taught what was false. And that is one of the things I saw, that there is a real need within many of the Ukrainian churches for good biblical teaching. Many of the churches seem to be caught between what some call the word of faith movement, like what that woman had been exposed to, and then others seem to be caught up in a very rigid kind of legalism. And so there is a need. I think this is one of the things that Glenn was trying to do. Glenn Brown he was going and spending time with these pastors to just help to ground them in the Word and help them grow spiritually beyond these things. Well, after Sunday morning, we went to that fine eating establishment of McDonald's, and turns out it's a really big McDonald's in Kiev, and it's considered the place for the upper middle class and above to go. It is a destination dining spot. If for nothing other than the fact it has air conditioning. I think it was about 90 degrees the entire time we were there, more humidity than I like, and McDonald's had air conditioning. I almost stayed in McDonald's the rest of the trip. So we had a good time there, and then, because Sergey is a pastor, he was officiating a wedding in the afternoon. He says, well, you guys come to the wedding. I'm going, Sergey, we don't know anybody at the wedding. No, you're my guest. They'll love to have you. You come to the wedding. So Mike and I ended up being guests of honor at a Ukrainian wedding, which was a lot of fun. And this couple were so cute. He was just ecstatic about getting married. He, I think, grinned and cried through the whole ceremony, and just a sweet couple and a very fun event to be part of. I would show you some videos of the old couple dancing, but that'll be another time. A lot of fun. From there, we had to leave the wedding a little early and get on a train to head to Mukachevo. And we discovered that Ukrainians, and we were told this before, they don't like to be early for things, which includes trains. In fact, the later you are to the train, apparently the better it is, because the train was leaving in 10 minutes, and we were still in traffic trying to get to the front of the station. And I'm looking at Mike like, so if we miss this one, when's the next train, and it's not for a day or so. So we did make the train. We ran a big train station, but we made it. And then we had 11 hours in a sleeper car on our way to Lviv, which is a city known for its artists and its culture. And then from Lviv, we went on to Mukachevo. Mukachevo is a very pretty little city. It's built on the river. They were telling us, since it's back to school time, their school year starts the same time as ours. They said there's a tradition there that the graduating seniors, the first day of school, everyone dresses in their uniforms, and they parade through the streets with all the bells ringing, and they carry the incoming first graders on their shoulders. Kind of a cool tradition, huh? This is where the Eunice Brown Home is located, and the Eunice Brown Home that we've helped to support cares for 12 orphans. Back to David. Hide not your face from me. Turn not your servant away in anger, O you who have been my help. Cast me not off. Forsake me not, O God of my salvation. For my father and my mother have forsaken me, but the Lord will take me in. These children, for a variety of reasons, have been forsaken by their mother and father. And yet there have been believers who have funded a home and made a place for them to be taken in. When you have a bunch of kids, you discover you also have a lot of shoes. And people ask about the food. I really enjoy Ukrainian food. Much of it is very similar to stuff that we would eat. Something you do get a lot of is you get a lot of tomatoes. You get a lot of tomatoes. You actually get a lot of tomatoes. Every meal had just like a bowl of fresh, raw, sliced tomatoes. And then you have, in fact, for breakfast, you would have a big bowl of tomatoes on the table along with sliced raw onion. Now, that'll get your day started right. Cucumbers, cheese, sausage, and then whatever the main course was on top of that. Also ate a lot of borscht, a lot of eggplant, but it was all good stuff. One of the problems you have in the orphanages, and this is true, I think, of almost any orphanage, is what happens when kids age out. Because once they turn 18, they can't stay in the orphanage. And how are they prepared to make life on their own? Because they still don't have the family structure to fall back on. And sadly, many of the kids do not do well once they are forced out into the big world. One of the places we met that they apparently doing a great job is the Mukachevo Children's Home. These are just two of the kids there. There's a whole group of girls that are at this home as well. They actually specialize in taking in Roma orphans, that is gypsy orphans, which in many ways is even harder. A lot of these kids have come out of very abusive backgrounds. So they're kids coming with a real deficit already. By culture, the Roma are there's a lot of prejudice against them, and so these are kids that you would anticipate when they age out and hit the big world, they're not going to do well. But this home, they were telling me, they've had a really great success rate with their kids who have grown up and left. And I think it's because the couple, in fact, I know it's the couple that run it, Igor and Natasha, are just wonderful people that love the Lord. And they just pour that on those kids. And they just said, these kids are our kids. We are a family. When they age out of here, they don't age out of here. We are still family. They are always welcome to come back. And they're just doing a great ministry there. One of the other orphanages we went to was called Pavlovo's Home. I understand this was funded by a surgeon in Florida. And interestingly, one of the other principals involved with this is an architect out of Edmonds who has actually done architectural work for us as a church. So who knew? But there we were at Pavlovo's home. They had a very hard thing happen this last year. The man who is the house father, I guess you'd say, a guy named Vasya, has been like a bundle of energy. They said he's just a handyman, can-do kind of guy. He was up on a ladder working on the peak of one of the roofs there, apparently reached too far and fell. And hit his head and has had just terrible neurological damage. And they're still reeling from this. He's not able to get himself around. He's got a tracheotomy in. It's just a very sad situation. And so not only are they trying to care for him in a place where medical care is not real good, but now also trying to figure out how do we care well for these children. So if you think of Vasya and Pavlovo's home, you could pray for them as they work through this. This is actually the home where Anita grew up. Remember the gypsy girl I told you was out working with youth in East Ukraine? Well, she grew up all the way in the West and was raised in this home. And just a testament to the good things that come out of many of these orphanages. But life is hard. We were in Mukachevo. We got talking about what do people earn. And they said, well, a trained radiologist in Mukachevo earns about $100 a month. That gives you a sense of the economy there. It's made even more difficult because there is so much corruption. In fact, as I was reading Psalm 27, it's interesting that David says, "Give me not up to the will of my adversaries, for false witnesses have arisen against me, and they breathe out violence." David understood what it was like to deal with people that were manipulative, that would lie, that would corrupt, that would twist the system to meet their agenda. And he asked for God to deliver him. And this is a huge problem in Ukraine. Wherever we'd go, we'd talk to people about what are the problems. And the answer always came back, corruption. I met a young Ukrainian man in Budapest, and Hungary is actually doing quite well. And I asked him, I said, why is Hungary doing so well and Ukraine is doing so bad? And he doesn't blink. He says, corruption. If you go to the hospital, you have to pay bribes to the doctors and nurses to get care. If you want a job, you have to pay bribes to the boss to get hired. If you go to court, you have to pay the judge to get the verdict you want. But they said to us, they said, all judges take bribes, without exception. That's the way it happens here. In fact, we met a church that had their church stolen from them. It was right in Mukachevo, a fairly good-sized city, and this church had their own building they were meeting in, and the local mob boss, and you can tell who the mob boss is. I mean, his house was not too far from the orphanage. As we're walking along the river dike, you come by this one house that is like markedly better than everything around it. I mean, it has rolled turf lawns, it has indoor pool, it has armed security guards at the front gate. This house is special. Well, he's the guy that runs the town. He decided he wanted that church building. So he has one of his guys become a member of the church, or 2 or 3 of them, and they found a little loophole in the church constitution that it didn't state what the minimum number of people you needed for a quorum for a church business meeting. So his henchmen show up with a bus, park it across the street, and put armed men in front of the bus so none of the church members can get to the church. The 3 guys who had become members of the church, they all go inside and they call a business meeting. And then they have a unanimous vote to fire the pastor and to deed the property over to the mob boss, which they took to the court, and the judge, who'd been well paid, signed off on all the paperwork. The church now meets in a school building and has no building of their own because it was stolen from them. That's what we mean by corruption. One of the people that we met who is a really good friend of that boss is this guy. This is Ivan. Ivan was the arm wrestling champion of Ukraine. I took him fairly easily. Not so much. Ivan actually has a published challenge for $400. He'll give you $400 if anybody can do his 7 lifts. Okay, guys, so you're ready for an easy $400? Here it is. This is all you have to do. You have to deadlift 700 pounds once. You've got to squat 660 pounds once. You need to do 1 bench press at 460 pounds, 36 reps on the bench at 220 pounds, something called a wrist twist at 850 pounds, and 30 curls, 70 pounds each arm. And then he had a thing he called cups that weigh 17 pounds each, and you have to hold those in your arms straight out in front for a full minute without wavering. And if you do that, $400 is yours. Now, what Ivan does for a living is he changes money in the market. And I was talking to guys, and they said, yeah, they've seen Ivan in the market with thousands of dollars in his hands, just changing it openly in the market, not worried that anyone is going to bother him. For one thing, the guy can deadlift 700 pounds. The other thing is he's a good friend with the guy that runs the town. You don't mess with Ivan. Ivan is rich. Ivan is powerful. Ivan likes talking to Christians. He made time to come and have coffee with us. He was excited to meet us. But there's one thing that Ivan can't control. Ivan can't change the fact that his wife Inga has cancer, and she's very close to death. Ivan has tried everything that he can. He had her in the hospital. He didn't feel the doctor was doing enough to care for his wife. He decked the doctor and knocked him out cold on the floor. That did improve medical care at the hospital. He spent a lot of money. He's done all he can do. But it doesn't matter how much power Ivan has. It doesn't matter how much he can lift. It doesn't matter how much money he has. He can't control this. And as we talked, you could see the tears well up from this big, tough man because he can't beat death. And so he's trying to be a good Russian Orthodox. He said he's been trying to do good things and trying to give money to the church. And his hope is that if he's good enough, that maybe God will smile. And maybe his wife will get better, or maybe she'll go to heaven. Maybe he'll go to heaven, but he's not sure because he says no one can be sure. All you can do is just work hard. And we shared with him, like his Christian friends have shared over and over, that Ivan, it's not what you do that makes you right with God. It's grace. Ivan's not ready to accept that yet. But if you want to pray for Ivan, you can pray for Ivan and for Inga, that they come to a place to realize that there is one who can do what they cannot do, and that he'll do it by grace out of love, not because of their works. Well, then we went to a gypsy youth camp, and this was pretty fun. Got to speak there. It's all done in Hungarian. The gypsies primarily speak Hungarian. And while I was there with those gypsy youth, I got to meet some pretty cool people. These guys, the guy right there, come here. There he is. That is Serge Landic. Serge is actually a Russian Jew who emigrated to New York years ago and became the personal Russian translator for David Wilkerson for 10 years at Times Square Church. And after Dave passed away, Serge now has moved to Ukraine, and he and his wife are there working with youth. Now, the guy right next to him is Chris Buher. Do any of you know the group called Asleep at the Wheel? People first service knew what Asleep at the Wheel was. Well, Chris played with Asleep at the Wheel for several years. He actually has 2 Grammy nominations. Fantastic musician. He and his wife have 5 children of their own, and they adopted 3 more Ukrainian kids, and then felt God was calling them to move to Ukraine. And they've gone there to see how they can serve, and specifically to serve among the gypsies. And Chris and I were talking, and of course, he is known kind of the height of fame as a musician. He came to Christ after his days with Asleep at the Wheel, and he said, you know, God never meant for a man to have 60,000 people screaming your name. He said that does all the wrong things to your soul. But he also talked about how God has set him free from that, and how he has found the joy and the peace in serving. His brother, Ben, is there as well, and Ben actually founded the Northwest Strings Camp in Chehalis. And so it's really big with fiddlers and guitarists and pianists to go to the Northwest Strings Camp. Well, that's Ben that founded that, and he too has moved to Ukraine, and just there to see how God wants to use them. Then we went to a Gypsy Leaders Convention, and the topic there was transformation. That was interesting because I spoke with 2 translators, one to Ukrainian, then one to Hungarian. So you had to kind of get in line and wait your turn to speak as it went back and forth down the chain. The first night we spoke in this little church here out in a gypsy village. The next morning it moved over to the large Ukrainian church in town. And Saturday morning, the first session, there were 2 sessions for the day. The first session lasted 5 hours without a break in 90-degree heat and no air conditioning. And because I was the guest of honor, they put me on the front row, which was about 20 feet from the speakers. And just out of curiosity, I finally pulled my phone out because I have a decibel meter on it and thought, I just want to know how loud this really is. And it went 95 to 104 decibels the entire 5 hours, which would be equivalent to hearing a 737 take off at 100 yards. It was loud. And I wasn't speaking till session number 2. So you just kind of sit there, and it went on and on and on. And then I have a translator next to me who's trying to translate for me. So I'm trying to hear over the 104 decibels what the English is. It was a long morning. The good thing, though, is that the music and dancing is really good because it is a Gypsy Leaders Convention. And they had a girls group that came as part of the program, and they performed, and I thought you might enjoy it. Check out the little girl in the middle. But Mom, they love me. Teach me your way, O Lord. Lead me on a level path because of my enemies. David's prayer that God would teach him his way. I mentioned that one of the struggles I see in at least parts of the Ukrainian church is a zeal for God, but sometimes not a lot of knowledge of his word. And I have to say that in that 5-hour first session, I think I heard one scripture reference to. Great zeal, but a need for more depth. Their topic was transformation. For my part, I talked about John the Baptist, who was a man of transformation for sure, but the transformation didn't play out the way he thought it was going to. He ended up in prison, and maybe you recall, the Bible says that John, there in that prison, sends messengers to Jesus to say, are you really the one? Did I miss it somehow? Because this isn't how I thought it was going to play out. And Jesus says, John, don't lose faith. I'm still doing what I said I would do. Hang in there. And I shared that with them because when you talk about transformation in that culture, it's great to be excited. It's great to talk about great and mighty things that God can do. But the fact is, God often does great and mighty things in slow and small ways. And these people face a lot of opposition, not only the corruption, the prejudice, the economy, so many challenges they face. And yet, God is doing great things, even though it may seem it's taking longer than they would like. The guy who spoke after me, I think he saw the same issue. He's been pastoring there for 20 years, and he too talked about how transformation often comes in the midst of disappointment and suffering, and yet what God teaches us even in suffering. Psalm 27:14 would have been a good passage. Wait for the Lord. Be strong, and let your heart take courage. Wait for the Lord. I love how the NIV says this. It says, wait for the Lord, be strong and take heart, and wait for the Lord. Isn't that hard? Isn't it hard when you know what you want to see God do, what you're praying for, you're working for, and yet it's not happening as fast or in the way that you wanted? And David knows that experience, and he preaches this little sermon to himself. He says, wait. Hang in there, take heart, but wait for the Lord. You know, there are three ways I think we can respond when God's answers seem slow. The first way we can respond is we can get pushy. We're going to make this happen no matter what. And in doing that, oftentimes we get ahead of God and ahead of his plans because we're trying to run our agenda. And maybe we're even convinced that our agenda must be God's agenda. But we're not willing to wait and to wait for his time. Now, there's another danger. If we're not pushy, we can go the other way on this, and that is to be passive, where we just don't care. We quit looking, we quit praying, we quit being expectant to see what God may do, and we just go on and lead our lives and expect nothing. The one I think is difficult is when you get right in the middle there to be patient. In fact, the line between patience and passivity is a hard one to sort out sometimes. Am I waiting patiently, or have I just given up hope? And sometimes God's work takes a lot longer than you thought it was going to take. When I left the ministry years ago, I felt God had shown us some stuff that said someday he was going to take me back into ministry. And so I'm like, okay, well, how soon is this all going to work out? And it was a lot longer and different than I ever suspected. And I can remember talking to Burnett and saying, I can't tell if I'm being patient or I'm being passive. And my wife, who has a gift of faith, kept saying, just wait. God will make it clear when it's time. And he did, in ways I never would have guessed. But God's like that. He didn't need me being pushy, but he did need me to wait. And so I just want to encourage you that if you're in one of those phases of life right now where it's not happening as fast or in the way as you thought it would, wait for the Lord. Take heart. God hasn't forgotten about you, but wait. Ministry in Ukraine calls for a lot of patience. One of the people we met was this young woman, Natasha. Natasha is a talented, well-educated young woman who left the good life of Kiev and moved out into Mukachevo, and from there she went to the outskirts and began building relationships in 5 different gypsy villages among the outcasts of the outcast. And there is Natasha out there loving and ministering to these people on her own. Her church in Kiev has no missions program at all and isn't motivated to get one. When she told them what she wanted to do, they said, well, be blessed. But they did nothing for her. So she works part-time as a secretary. She's an artist. She published a coloring book. She gets a little royalty off of that. And she's trying to make it on $300 a month. And she said most months she comes pretty close to making it. She's been out here, it's either 5 or 8 years she's been ministering like this because she loves the people. It is slow work. And yet she's got an idea this year, and God is opening the doors. She wants to start an after-school tutoring program. Does this sound familiar? This is the Ukrainian version of Boost happening there. And this little village that we went with her to, there is a building in it. There's this church building. It's vacant. This was built by a Dutch church a number of years ago, and nobody knows why. They raised the money, they built the building, and then everybody disappeared. There's never been anything that happened. It's just sitting there vacant. Inside, it has brand new school desks sitting there. The chief has a key for the building. They use it for a public gathering place once in a while, but it's just sitting there. Well, Natasha goes to the chief, tells him what she wants to do, and the chief finally buys into this idea of creating this tutoring program, and he says, well, you can use the building. So Natasha has a school building already provided for her. She's going to hire a teacher to come in because it's not really a tutoring program, it's really a school. But if they call it a school, remember that whole corruption problem? Well, they have to go through all these hoops to be a school. But if you're just tutoring kids, you don't have to worry about that. So they're going to teach these kids how to read. They're going to teach them basic math. Most of their parents are illiterate, and the parents often don't see the value of even sending their kids to school. And so having the chief on board saying, well, the kids are going to go to school, that's a big deal. And it says a lot to the trust that she has won with this man. When we got the kids together, the chief was very concerned that it be a good meeting, that the kids behave. So on the way in, he cut a switch and showed it to the kids and gave it to Natasha and told her to feel free to use it if she needed to. She didn't, but the kids were pretty well behaved. Thought it might be fun to see if you can recognize this kid's song sung in Hungarian by Ukrainian gypsy children. Any ideas? Head and shoulders, knees and toes. There you have it. These guys are right on the Hungarian border. In fact, interesting tidbit, many of the people in this part of Ukraine keep their clocks set on Hungarian time, which is an hour ahead. So whenever you ask someone what time something is at, you always have to clarify and say, is that Ukrainian time or Hungarian time? So they identify very strongly with their Hungarian roots. Well, from here, we headed farther west. We left Ukraine and headed to Budapest to get the flight home. It was another 6-hour train ride. And you can tell the landscape is just flat. This is true of much of Ukraine as well as Hungary. We arrived in Budapest, and it is a beautiful city. Thoroughly enjoyed Budapest. There's the Parliament building. This is a castle up at the top of the hill. Some of the great cathedrals. Look at the colored tiles on that roof. Another view of the castle. This is actually built into the rock, that particular building. And it was a hot day. It was 90 degrees. The college student who said he wanted to show us around, we knew his mother from Ukraine. He decided that we really didn't need to take the bus, that we'd see more if we were walking. So we pretty much walked about 7 to 8 miles in Budapest, and I feel like I have really experienced the city. The city is even more beautiful at night. Everything is lit up. Well, how do we wrap it up? First thing I would say is pray for Ukraine. Pray for the kids growing up in orphanages. Pray for them as they age out and strike out on their own. Pray for spiritual deepening in the churches there, that people would have both hope and a real knowledge of God. Pray for Mia, the Russian woman whose son died of diabetes. Pray for her heart to be healed and comforted. Pray for the patience and the wisdom of leaders and people who live in a society that they have to deal with corruption on a day-to-day basis. Pray for brothers and sisters who literally face armies and threats of violence. Pray for Natasha and the Roma village that she works in and the success of that tutoring program. Pray for people like Chris and Ben and Serge who have left the comfort of home to serve those who are unfortunate. And personally, maybe you're facing some kind of deep opposition right now in your life. It's not a physical army, but it feels like one. I just want to remind you, as David reminded himself, God is on your side. And if God's on your side, it doesn't matter who's on the other side. And maybe you're being forced to wait longer than you ever imagined you would have to wait. God hasn't forgotten you. Wait for the Lord. Don't be pushy. Don't be passive. Be patient. Be strong. Take heart. And wait for the Lord. Amen.